Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the 2017-2018 Jewish History series here at Beverly Hills Synagogue. And we're going to take up the story roughly from where we left off a couple of years ago, when we did a series that ended with the Hasmoneans, the Maccabees. And I thought it's appropriate before Hanukkah to talk about the Hasmoneans, the Maccabees. And we know the story, or we think we know the story, because we're so familiar with the story. It's Rabim biyad ma'atim, Zaydim biyad oiskei seirosecha. Right? That's the story. The story is that there were many Greeks and very few Maccabees, Hasmoneans, whatever they were. And there were those who were Zaydim, they were not appropriate. Hold on a second, I'm going to want to record this, which I forgot. So we're going to take up the story from the moment in around 160 something, when the Maccabees really took over. 164 BCE, before the Common Era, when the five sons, and we're going to get to the dynastic tree in a minute, but the five sons of Matisyahu Kohen Gadol, Matityahu, who, by the way, was never a high priest. He may have been a very great man. He was certainly a priest. He had 5 wonderful children. They led the Jews to victory against the Seleucid Greeks, but he was never the high priest. He was never the Kohen Gadol, mainly, by the way, because in order to be a Kohen Gadol in those days, you had to be someone who was willing to bribe a lot of people. It was a totally corrupt office. It was a political office, had nothing whatsoever to do with your piety or to do with your spirituality, or indeed with your knowledge of what it is that you needed to in order to be a high priest. He was never a high priest. They were fed up with the Hellenization of the temple in Jerusalem, of Jerusalem in general, the ruling class in Judea, and they led this revolt against the Seleucid Greeks. Initially it was against the Jews, and then Antiochus from our story of Hanukkah led the battle against the Maccabees. He lost, and this is where we're going to take up the story. You've all read George Orwell's book, Animal Farm, I take it, where the pigs lead the revolt against the farmer and take over. And by the end of the book, the pigs have become the farmers. And that's what happened with the Hasmonean dynasty. So the very people who had led the Jews back into the traditions of their patriarchs, of their forefathers, of Judaism as it was at that time, suddenly turned into the very people, they morphed into the very people they'd been fighting against and became the Hellenized leaders of the Jews. But now they had the support of all the countries around them and all of the leading powers in the region. So it wasn't just a random group of people, let's say a high priest who bribed somebody, this official or bribed that official. This was an official ruling group of individuals, a family, and it led from one to the other. There'd never been kings in the Jewish world who'd come from any other tribe besides for Judah since the days of King David. And yet they came from the tribe of Levi. So you're wondering to yourselves why I'm speaking about the Hasmonean dynasty if the title of this lecture, this 2-part series, is Herod the Great. Herod the Great wasn't a Hasmonean. And yet I've called him in the title the last Hasmonean king or the last Maccabee king, and he wasn't. So why have I referred to him in this way? And in order to get to the bottom of the story, I'm actually going to ask you a question about the siege of Jerusalem. Everyone here has heard about the siege of Jerusalem? If I were to say those three words, siege of Jerusalem, what would you think of? Which era would you think of? 70 AD. That's the first answer anyone gives. The Roman siege of Jerusalem and the Jewish revolt against the Roman Empire and the Roman control of its vassal state, Judea, 70 AD or 70 CE. Any other siege of Jerusalem you care to mention? Well, 1948 would be the one which we should mention in the 70th year of the State of Israel. We didn't win that siege. There's another siege, Nebuchadnezzar. It's in Tanakh, right? There's a siege of Jerusalem where the Babylonians attempted to gain entry, eventually did, and destroyed the Beit HaMikdash. There's another siege of Jerusalem, Sancherev, right? Also in Tanakh. Wasn't very successful either. Suddenly, the entire army was destroyed by a plague. Any other sieges of Jerusalem you'd care to mention? What the Hanukkah story, right? There was a siege of Jerusalem. Whether it was the Greeks who put the siege together against whoever was in Jerusalem at the time, or eventually it was the Hasmoneans, the Maccabees, who did a siege against the Greeks, and eventually they were expelled. But I'm actually going to take you to the most important and the most significant siege of Jerusalem that no one has ever heard of. I call it the lesser-known siege of Jerusalem. In the year 63 BC, Jerusalem was besieged, and it would change Jewish history, and to this day we are affected by that siege of Jerusalem. How did it happen? Who were the soldiers? Who were the generals? Who were the significant figures in the siege, the lesser-known siege of Jerusalem? So I think that we're now going to take a look at a family tree of the Hasmonean kings. Can everyone read that? Okay, somewhat. At the top of the tree is Matityahu Kohen Gadol, who we mentioned in the Hanukkah story, and his 5 sons. And Matityahu died even before Jerusalem was retaken, before the Beit HaMikdash, before Chafhei Kislev, before the menorah was lit and remained alight for 8 days. He had died, and his most significant son was Yehuda Maccabee, but he died in war. He died on the battlefield. And there was another one, Yonatan Maccabee. He was the high priest from 152 to 142. And then in 142, Shimon, another son of Matityahu, took over as the leader of the Jews, the leader of Judea, and he was a great consolidator. He managed to get all the different factions in his, I guess we'll call it a kingdom. At that stage, it wasn't yet a kingdom. It was just a region. He managed to get all the factions together. In addition to which, he managed to deal with external threats, make pacts with local powers, make sure that there was enough leverage to use against other powers who threatened them, because there's always 2 things that you need to concern yourself with if you're a leader, and that is that there shouldn't be any internal problems, particularly in the ancient world. Internal problems in the country meant that you didn't have a very long shelf life, you were going to die very quickly. There's no elections in ancient Judea. In ancient history, you weren't elected to office. If they didn't like you, they didn't vote you out, they assassinated you. So you had to be careful that you didn't make too many enemies, or if you made enemies, that they were under control and they wouldn't be a threat to you. In addition to which, you have to make sure that within the jigsaw puzzle of the ancient powers, that you retain enough power that you can prevent anyone from the outside coming in, but you're not perceived as that powerful that people want to destroy you. It's a balance. And Shimon, the son of Matityahu, was the first ruler of Judea. He was a high priest. He wasn't considered a king at that stage, They came from a family of Kohanim, and he took over as the high priest, which was a political office, and he established the Hasmonean dynasty. And he had various children, one of whom, John Hyrcanus, was a very belligerent military man. And I imagine that the name John isn't actually John, it's Yochanan. Hyrcanus is a Greek-sounding name. And you see that suddenly the family has evolved from being this very Hebrew-sounding family, Shimon, Yonatan, Yehuda, Matityahu. Suddenly you've got the name Hyrcanus, which is not a Hebrew name, and Hyrcanus, John Yochanan Hyrcanus, becomes the high priest in the year 134, and he rules for 30 years. And he has got various children, as you can see, and we're going to take up the story with his oldest son, who's known historically as Aristobulus. Again, not a very Jewish-sounding name, but his name was really Yehuda. Yehuda is called after his great uncle, and Yehuda Aristobulus became the king in 104 to 103. Now, if you were to reflect on which team the Hasmoneans, the dynasty, which team they would back in terms of Judaism, in terms of the way Jewish life should be governed, would you say that they would be traditionalists, or would you say they would be Hellenists? Well, going by the original revolt against the Greeks, it would make most sense that they would be traditional, very conservative, observe halakha, whatever halakha was in those days. This is before the days that the Talmud had been written down. Everything is conveyed through oral tradition, but they're very, very punctilious in their observances of all the different aspects of temple duty. The temple is the center of Jewish life. In Yerushalayim, the Kohanim are the ones who govern the temple together with the Levites. You would imagine that they would hold by this traditional view. In fact, the traditionalists, as we're going to hear a little bit later on, were the Pharisees. The Pharisees were the common folk. They were the ordinary Jew, the farmers. They were the shopkeepers. They were the traders. They were the people who were dealing with foreign traders as well on the coast, in the coastal cities and towns. The Pharisees were the traditionalists, and our Judaism, the Judaism that we are familiar with, is descended, as it were, from the Pharisaic tradition. Rabbinic Judaism that we practice, which is based on the Talmud, is based on the Pharisaic view, which we're going to hear more about later on. The Sadducees weren't traditionalists. The majority of them, not all of them, as we're going to see, the majority of them were Hellenized. The Sadducees were very keen to maintain very positive and close relationships with at that time, the descendants of the Greek ruling party. Okay. So, the Aristobulus was very irritated by Pharisees. He felt that there shouldn't be such a thing as Pharisaic tradition controlling, or Pharisaic practices controlling the way Jews conducted themselves in ancient Judea, in his country. In addition to which, he decided that it's not good enough for him to be called high priest, because high priest is a religious functionary, right? That's what you are. What are you if you're the high priest? You're somebody who has to bring korbanot. You're somebody who has to accept terumah. I mean, it's a very nice thing, but essentially what you are is a bureaucrat. He didn't want to be a bureaucrat. Even if that bureaucracy came with power, he wanted to be equal to all the rulers around him in the region, in the Middle East, in the Near East. He wanted to be a king, but there'd never been a king of Judea since the time of the First Temple. At that time, there was two kingdoms. There was a northern kingdom, was the kingdom of Israel, a southern kingdom, which was the kingdom of Judah. But the kings had all come either from the tribe of Judah or descendants of Joseph. That's the way the monarchy had worked during the First Temple period. Now these are descendants of Levi, they're Kohanim. He wants to be king. He declares himself the king of Judea. Not only that, he has himself recognized by other local kings, nearby regions, nearby countries, and they recognize him as the king. The Pharisees are extremely angry, and they say, this is not part of our tradition. We can't possibly accept a king that's descended from Levi. We can't accept a Kohen Gadol who is also a king. You can't be one and the other. You can't take these two roles and merge them into one. And they opposed him. And he began to persecute the Pharisees. He was married to a woman called Salome Alexandra. Salome Alexandra is known in Hebrew as Shlom Tzion, peace to Zion. Salome, shalom. Alexandra is not a name that you would associate necessarily with Hebrew or with Jew. But ever since Alexander the Great had peacefully marched into the land of Israel in the year 332, the name Alexander had been fairly common even among very traditional Jews. And the reasons why she's called Alexandra, by the way, is because ultimately she married Aristobulus' brother, which we'll see in a moment. Aristobulus died quite quickly. Within a few months of taking office and declaring himself king, he died. And before he died, for whatever reason, Shlom Tzion, Salome, told him that one of his brothers was Antigonus, was a traitor against him and was plotting to replace him as the king. And she demanded that he be killed and executed for treachery, for being a traitor against the monarchy. And he agreed and killed that brother. Now he died, so it's, how many of them are there? Or have we lost them? Can we go back to so how many of them are there? There's Antigonus, there's Aristobulus. Absalom is not a significant figure in the family. So when Aristobulus dies, Alexander Janneus, Alexander Yanai Hamelech, as he's referred to in Chazal, takes over as the king of Judea. What is the law if a woman is married to someone and dies childless and there's a brother? Yibum. She's got to marry him. So Salome Alexandra marries Alexander Yanai and takes on his name. So we don't really know her name. I'm not even sure her name was Shlom Tzion. We don't know what her name was. But what is significant about her, extremely significant, is that she was a Pharisee. Not only was she a Pharisee, her brother was a rabbi called Shimon ben Shetach, who was the head of the Sanhedrin. Shimon ben Shetach is a very interesting man. Shimon ben Shetach was the leader, there was always pairs. If you look at in Avot, at the beginning of Avot, where it reckons all the different generations of rabbis that had contributed to the Talmud, the third generation, every generation is a pair, the third generation is Shimon ben Shetach, and we have a quotation from him in the Mishnah there, and another one who's called Yehuda ben Taboi. There's a Gemara, we've learnt the Gemara in the Shir. The Gemara says that Yehuda ben Taboi was so incensed with the way that the Tzidukim, the Sadducees, interpreted the Torah, particularly their interpretation of the law of Eid Zomem, of a false witness, that he once put to death a false witness to prove that the method by which the Pharisees derived the law was superior to the method which the Sadducees use. And he went very proudly, and he told Shimon ben Shetach, you'll never guess what I did this morning. I had a man executed. Why did you have him executed? Because he was a false witness, and the Tzidukim in the court didn't want to have him executed because their interpretation of the Torah is different than ours, but I insisted that he be executed. Said Shimon ben Shetach, you just murdered an innocent man. Because we never kill one witness, it has to be both witnesses who are found to be zomamin, who are found to be false. And the Gemara says that Yehuda ben Taboi, from that day onwards, totally deferred to Shimon ben Shetach, who became the leading rabbi of the generation. And in fact, he went and wept every day at the tomb of this false witness, or I guess he was a false witness, who had been put to death erroneously at his word, and eventually he died. The Gemara is a very dramatic Gemara, but it gives you some sense of who Shimon ben Shetach was. Shimon ben Shetach wasn't just an ordinary Pharisee. He was the greatest rabbi of the generation. We'd refer to him today as the Gadol Hador. His sister was the wife of the biggest anti-Pharisee, anti-rabbi of the time, and the most powerful Jew of the time, first Aristobulus and then Alexandra and Janneus. Shimon ben Shetach was forced to go into hiding. The Gemara has some very dramatic stories about Salome Alexandra bringing him out of hiding after getting a promise from her husband that he would come to no harm. Her brother would come to no harm. And conversations, we don't know, they were obviously recorded and passed down from generation to generation. They sound very dramatic. You know, they spoke to each other very roughly, the king speaking to the head of the Sanhedrin very roughly, and the head of the Sanhedrin responding in kind. But whether or not Shimon ben Shetach ever had these conversations and was able to take on his brother-in-law on equal terms because his sister was the queen, made no difference to the rest of the Pharisees, who were persecuted mercilessly, absolutely mercilessly, by Alexandra and Janneus, who is considered by Chazal to be one of the most wicked kings of the Second Temple, this period of the Hasmonean monarchy. A very wicked man who at the slightest provocation would execute and murder thousands of people, as we'll see in a moment. Who were Shimon ben Shetach and Salome Alexandra? Where were they from? Which family did they come from? We don't know. We don't know any details about their ancestry. We can look at Josephus, and there are some vague references here and there. What we do know is they came from a very wealthy Pharisee family, which was unusual, because most of the Pharisees were not wealthy. They were middle class and less. The wealthy aristocracy of the Jewish world in that time were all Sadducees, which is another way of saying they were assimilated. They weren't interested in their Judaism. They were only interested in it as a trapping of identity, but they weren't to their core committed to the Jewish faith, including the high priests and the priests who ran the temple. The Sanhedrin, this is when the change began from the leadership of the Jewish world being seen as the priesthood to the leadership suddenly becoming the rabbinate. Suddenly the Sanhedrin took on a much greater significance because the rabbis became the moral and religious leadership of the nation, and they also became the repository of tradition. If you wanted to know what does it mean to be a Jew in this situation or that situation, you couldn't go to the priest, because even if he told you something, you wouldn't necessarily believe him, and he may not even know. Whereas if you went to a rabbi, they were very keen in keeping the traditions. They had this process of memorizing texts and then repeating them in a public space so that other people could hear them, remember them, discuss them. All the discussions that we have recorded in the Mishnah and later in the Talmud and the Midrash, all the Midrashim, are all the result of the Pharisaic dedication to recording the traditions of Jewish life. And that's how we have them. We only have them now because the Pharisees were so dedicated to this task. She married Alexandra and Janneus. She's a Yevoma. And they had two sons, Hyrcanus and Aristobulus. I want to tell you that neither Hyrcanus nor Aristobulus were particularly special in any way. So Hyrcanus was, by all accounts, an extremely lazy, indolent, take it easy type of guy. His brother, Aristobulus, was not, but he was prone to violence. He loved military. He loved leading bands of military men, armies into battle, which is an extremely unusual thing for a Kohen to do. Thank you very much. An extremely unusual thing for a Kohen to do, because as you know, a Kohen isn't allowed to be in the vicinity of a dead body, never mind be involved in the killing of people. And yet, he was a warrior. Now, we know the situation in the story of Hanukkah, where necessity demanded that the Maccabi, the Hasmonean family, the children of Matityahu, involved themselves in a battle against the Seleucid Greeks. But elective wars were not the arena of Kohanim, of priests. And yet Aristobulus was a warrior. So Alexander Janneus, we're going back to him, began his reign by going to war with somebody called Ptolemy, the son of Cleopatra. Not the Cleopatra who we're familiar with through the story of Julius Caesar, Mark Antony, and that Cleopatra came much later, and we're going to hear about her in the story of Herod. This was an earlier Cleopatra. She was the queen of Egypt. Now, they weren't Egyptians. These are not pharaohs. These are Greeks who had taken over Egypt, and after Alexander the Great had died, his kingdom was divided into 5 separate regions. One of them was taken over by a family called Ptolemy, and they all took that name. Another one was taken over by Seleucus, and that's where the Seleucids who controlled Syria came from. They were the ones who attacked Eretz Israel during the time of Hanukkah. Cleopatra came from this Greek family that controlled Egypt, and she didn't get on with her son. And her son had run away to Cyprus, and for whatever reason, it's not clear why, Alexander Janneus decided to go to war with this son of Cleopatra. And he went to war, and he wasn't an experienced military strategist, and he was losing the war, and Cleopatra stepped in to contain her son. Because she didn't get on with her son, she suddenly allied herself with Alexander Janneus. So now he has a very powerful ally. The Egyptian queen is now an ally of Judea. Cleopatra wanted to take over Judea, which was quite a common thing in those days. So if you went and allied yourself with a weaker ruler, you would now turn that country or that whatever it was, that state, into a vassal state, because without you, that state would have collapsed. So she decided she's taking over Judea. She's going to declare herself the queen or the empress of Judea. Now, you do know this because we discussed this in a previous series, that Egypt was full of Jews. There were a lot of Jews in Egypt. In fact, her head general was somebody who's referred to in Josephus as Ananias or Hananiah. And Hananiah tells Cleopatra, no, don't start with the Jews. If you start with the Jews, you're just going to have trouble. What you need to do is allow Alexander to be the king of the Jews, and you remain at his side. You can control him, but don't try and take over the country, because that's just going to lead to problems. Remember what happened to that foolish Antiochus for Epiphanes. He didn't end up too well. Don't do the same thing. Don't make the same mistake. So she agrees with her Jewish general, and she allows Alexander Janneus to take control of Judea again. Alexander Janneus feuded with the Pharisees. Now, he was a king for almost 30 years, and he constantly got into difficulty with the Pharisees. As I said, Shimon ben Shetach ran away. He hid in the mountains, eventually came out of hiding. Yehuda ben Taboi had to run to Egypt. And in fact, that's where he lived for many, many years, until he came back only after Alexander Janneus had died. One year, Alexander Janneus decided, he's the high priest, on Sukkot, that he's going to go and he's going to do the water libation. You know, we have Simchat Beit HaSho'eva, Sho'evat Mayim. They poured the water. It was a ritual that took place during Sukkot. Sukkot is a festival that revolves a lot around water, because it's the beginning of the season when they begin to pray for rain. There's one way of doing it if you're a Pharisee, and there's another completely different way of doing it if you're a Sadducee. Traditionally, even if the high priests were Sadducees, they would honor the Pharisaic way of doing things, because they knew that most of the religious folk were Pharisees. And if they offended the Pharisees, they would cause tremendous grief and we don't want to cause grief in the Beit HaMikdash. So they would honor the Pharisaic tradition. Alexander Janneus is not going to honor the Pharisaic tradition. He's the king. I'm the high priest and the king. They're going to listen to me. I'm not going to listen to them. So he poured the water out onto his feet. They got very angry, and the Gemara records that all the people in the Beit HaMikdash began to pelt him with their etrogim. They threw their etrogim at him. They said, I guess it was an ancient form of grenade. They bit off the pitum and they threw the etrog. And he's pelted with hundreds, thousands of etrogim. And he's the king. He became very angry. And he ordered all the people in the Beit HaMikdash to be arrested and had them all executed on Sukkot. Soon afterwards, he became embroiled in another war, another military escapade, which he almost lost. And at that stage, Shimon ben Shetach, who's his brother-in-law, took advantage of the situation, and they pushed in a bunch of Pharisees into positions of power. And civil war erupted. They say, Josephus, I don't know how much we can believe Josephus, but Josephus says more than 50,000 people died in this civil war, which is a huge number of people in such a small ancient country in the ancient world. And he continued to battle with the Pharisees. Eventually, Alexander sued for peace, and he sent, I guess, some kind of olive branch or whatever it was. He went to the United Nations Security Council of those days, and he said, listen, I need to make peace with the Pharisees. And they met around a table, and they said, what are your conditions, he asked them, for peace? They said, your death. When you die, we can be at peace. He wasn't keen on dying, and so they were forced to go back to war, and they did something really strange. They allied themselves with a man called Demetrius. He was the king of Syria, a descendant of Antiochus, believe it or not. The Pharisees, the traditionalists, now were allied with the king of Syria, who was a descendant of Antiochus, who'd wanted to undermine the traditions of Judaism. And they were against the Hellenized, as was the Assyrian king, the Greek king, against the Hellenized Jews who had at their head Alexander Janneus. Well, they went to war. They met on some battlefield. I don't know if you know this, but in ancient warfare, it's not like now, where it's stealth bombers and drones coming to shoot people but they don't know what's coming, and whatever it is, somebody in some room somewhere in Omaha, Nebraska, presses a button on a computer and a bomb explodes in Iraq. That's not the way it worked. What they would do is they'd send messengers to each other, and they'd decide to meet on a battlefield. It was all set-piece battles. So they met on a battlefield, and during the course of the battle, a bunch of Pharisees turned to each other. What exactly are we doing? We are fighting alongside Greeks, killing Jews. Have we gone crazy? And they abandoned the Pharisaic side, the Pharisees, and they joined Alexander Janneus' army. Well, guess what? Alexander Janneus won that battle. And he wasn't particularly happy to have had to fought it in the first place. And he captured and murdered all of his opponents. He identified 800 Pharisees who he felt had led the rebellion against him. And he had them all crucified. First, he hung them up on crosses outside the wall of Jerusalem. Then he murdered their wives and children as they were still alive, hanging on those crosses. And all the while, he was feasting, the Feast of Alexander. It's another version of it. He was feasting together with his concubines. That's what Josephus reports. This was not a pleasant individual. He died after 27 years on the throne. It had been a time of great turbulence. I would say that he won the battle, but as we're going to see, he lost the war. So what he had done was, instead of finding a way to coexist as a Sadducee or the Sadducee population coexisting with the Pharisees, all he had done is he'd hardened the feelings of the Pharisees that they could never possibly live alongside the Sadducees. And now, on his deathbed, knowing that his 2 children were not fit to be the king, because Hyrcanus was a layabout and useless, and his son Aristobulus was useless in other ways because he was too violent and out of control. I mean, it sounds like he was fairly out of control as well, but by his standards, he was out of control. So he named his wife, Salome Alexandra, to be the queen of Judea. It was a game changer, an absolute game changer. We now have the queen who'd stayed quiet for almost 30 years, married to 2 brothers who were against her party, as it were. Imagine that. She's a Democrat married to a Republican, or Republican married to a Democrat. She hadn't opened her mouth around the dinner table for almost 30 years. Now she's in charge. She is the kid in charge of the toy store. And she immediately has his prime minister executed. His prime minister was a man named, let me find his name, Diogenes. Probably a Sadducee if he was Jewish. May not even have been Jewish. Diogenes had been the one who had organized the murder of the 800 opponents after that battle where half of them had changed sides. She had him killed. Shimon ben Shetach became the de facto ruler of Judea, and the Sanhedrin now controlled all the legal activity of Jewish life, not just the ritual Jewish life, but also the civil Jewish life. She gave the reins of power over to the Pharisees, and that was the turning point in terms of the Judaism that we're familiar with, taking over and remaining in control and retaining control for the rest of Jewish history. We are benefiting from the decision of this anti-Pharisee king, Alexander Janneus, deciding on his deathbed to appoint his wife as queen instead of one of his sons. What's particularly strange, I guess not, is that Chazal, Shimon ben Shetach, and all his rabbinic friends would agree to a woman being the ruler of the Jewish nation. They not only agreed to it, but they praise her. The Gemara says there have never been more bountiful years than the years of Shlomtzion Hamalka and her brother Shimon ben Shetach. The rain fell when it was meant to fall. The harvests appeared when they were meant to appear. There were fantastic years economically, and that's all because she was such a righteous woman and her brother was such a fantastic, assistant in her monarchy. So she was the queen for 9 years, during which time the entire established control of Judea changed. And when she died, the question was, how are things going to unfold then? So I mentioned a little earlier that she'd murdered or executed, let's put it more judiciously, she'd executed her husband's prime minister. But her husband hadn't just had one advisor and chief cook and bottle washer, he'd had 2. The second one was a wily, cunning man called Antipater. Antipater was an Idumean. If we go back to the map, where's the map? Have we got the map here? So the map, if you see there, in the very northern part of the map, you have Galilee, which was considered a separate region. Then below it you have Samaria and Judea, which generally speaking was a combined region. And during the reign of John Hyrcanus, he managed to take over an area which is known as Idumea. What is Idumea? Anyone know what the Edom? Now I would suggest that there were no descendants of Esau living in Idumea. But it was identified with the region in the ancient land of Israel where Esau had settled. And at that stage, when John Hyrcanus took over, there were a lot of Gentiles living there. They were called Idumeans. And he said to them, listen, you can retain your ownership of the land if you want, but in order to do that, you have to be Jewish, because otherwise you're not allowed to own land if it's a Jewish country. And therefore, you have a choice. Either you convert, or I'm going to take away your land. Well, guess what? The Idumeans converted en masse. One of the Idumeans who converted was the father of Antipater. I don't know what these conversions entailed, and I cannot tell you if the modern-day state of Israel, Rabbanut, would have accepted those conversions. We'll have to discuss that another time. But the entire Idumean nation converted, and now you have this Antipater as the lead advisor to Alexander Janneus. Now, imagine this. If he's advising Alexander Janneus, are his sympathies Sadducee or are they Pharisee? Well, clearly they must be Sadducee. In order to survive as an advisor to a king whose sympathies lie with the Sadducees, you must be sympathetic to the Sadducees. As soon as Diogenes was killed, remarkably, Antipater became one of the greatest lovers of Pharisees in the history of the Jewish nation. And he told Salome Alexandra he would do everything in his power to ensure the smooth transition into a Pharisee-controlled country. And he became the chief advisor to Salome Alexandra, who had her brother at her side, and this triumvirate ruled Judea. Antipater was a fantastic politician, Machiavellian in everything that he did. He knew the levers of power. He knew which buttons to push. He knew which levers to pull. He knew who had to be complimented and who had to be treated toughly. He was a brilliant politician. When Salome Alexandra died, he is now left with a choice of two people to support for king. It's either going to be Hyrcanus, the indolent, lazy son, or it's going to be Aristobulus, who's the militaristic, violent son. Which one do you think he would pick? What? Hyrcanus. Because if you want to be in control, you don't choose the one who's violent. You don't choose Sonny Corleone, right? You choose the weak son. And he chose Hyrcanus. And he says to Hyrcanus, your future lies with me. Listen to me, follow my every move. You should know something. Your brother wants you killed, which wasn't true at all, because he didn't feel threatened by Hyrcanus. Hyrcanus would be quite happy to stay on as high priest, which was the position he had been appointed to when his mother was the queen. But he convinced him his brother wanted to kill him. He then spirited him away from Jerusalem to the Nabatean kingdom. The Nabatean kingdom is a long-forgotten kingdom. Can we have a picture of the Nabatean kingdom here somewhere? So the Nabatean kingdom is not remembered. You see the sort of red ribbon lines, right? There's one at the top and one at the bottom. Modern-day Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and the entire Sinai was the Nabatean kingdom. They weren't known as warriors. They're referred to by Josephus as Arabs, as basically peaceful people, and they had their capital in a place called Petra, which you're all familiar with. We have a picture of Petra here. Petra was their capital. If anyone's ever been there, it's a spectacular place. It's in modern-day Jordan. The king there was a man called King Aretas. King Aretas and Antipater were very close friends. Antipater whispered into his ear and said as follows, listen, do you remember Alexander Janneus went to war with you and took away 12 of your cities? He says, yeah, of course I remember. He said, do you want them back? He said, yes. He said, well, all I need is you to demonstrate your support for Hyrcanus as the king and bring the entire Nabatean army to Jerusalem to demonstrate that you support his kingdom or his reign as opposed to his brother. All right, Aretas wants his cities back because cities is money, because everyone in a city pays tax. So he immediately ordered up, he took his army, and marched towards Jerusalem. 50,000 soldiers besieged Aristobulus. We're not yet at the lesser-known siege. We're going to get there. 50,000 Nabatean soldiers threatened Jerusalem on its outskirts and told Aristobulus he had to allow his brother Hyrcanus to be the king. Obviously, Hyrcanus also had Jewish supporters, and it turned out that those Pharisees, as we would see 100 years later with the siege of Jerusalem that ended up in the destruction of the temple, the Pharisees could be pretty tough and uncompromising and unbending. Remember the Sicarii and the Zealots who refused to allow Jerusalem to surrender to Rome? Well, they could be quite nasty when the shoe was on the other foot. So Josephus records the following story. The poor folk who were caught in the siege of Jerusalem, they were conscious of the fact that it was almost Pesach. And they said, we'd like to bring the Korban Pesach. All of us in the city would like to bring Korban Pesach. No problem, they said. How much does a lamb cost? I don't know, it costs 100 zuz. Right, give us 1,000 zuz per lamb, and we will give you the lambs over the ramparts. We'll raise them up using ropes. Well, they sent down the money, and then the supporters of Hyrcanus, the Pharisees, refused to send them the lambs. So they were without lambs. They'd denuded them of all their wealth, and now they had no lambs to slaughter for Pesach. Josephus records a very strange story. Do you remember coming across somebody in the Midrash, in the Talmud, called Choni HaMa'agel? Choni HaMa'agel is a curious figure, mysterious figure. He is a miracle worker in an age where miracle working is already frowned upon, at least officially. What people do behind closed doors we can't say, but certainly as a form of public worship, we don't have Navi, we don't have a prophet, we don't have miracle workers, we don't do that kind of thing anymore. He fancies himself like Elisha or Eliyahu, and particularly fancies himself as a rainmaker. And the story is recorded in the Gemara that he challenged God. He said to God, unless you send rain, I'm not going to step out of this circle, ma'agel. That's why he says he drew a circle, choni ha'ma'agel. And God sent some drizzle, some light drizzle. And he said, well, that's not what I was talking about, God. This is not called rain. I meant proper rain. And then it began raining. And Chazal, the rabbis of the time, were extremely angry with him. Then there's this very strange story, sort of a Rip Van Winkle story about him sleeping for 70 years and waking up and nobody knowing him, etc. Josephus records a very different end to Choni HaMa'agel's life. The supporters of Hyrcanus found him outside the walls of Jerusalem, and they called him, and they said, Mr. HaMa'agel, would you do something for us? He said, sure. He said, would you curse our opponents? Sort of like what Balak did with Bilam. So he said, sure, of course, I'll do whatever you want. And he stood up, and instead of cursing them, he said, may both sides find a peaceful resolution between themselves. And they killed him. They executed him because they said he was a traitor to the cause of the Pharisee movement. That's how Josephus records the end of Choni HaMa'agel. But now we're going to turn to a totally different side of the same period in history. Something called the Roman Republic. The Roman Republic that was about to become the Roman Empire. You all know what's the Roman Republic? The democratically run by the Senate of Rome. Roman, wasn't yet an empire, the Roman region, any place that was under the control of Rome was run democratically by the senators of Rome. And suddenly there were three key figures, very powerful figures in Rome. One of them was called Pompey. The other one was called Julius, not yet Caesar. Later would become Julius Caesar, the emperor of Rome and the Roman Empire. And the final one was a man called Crassus, not so widely known. They formed the first triumvirate that controlled the Roman Republic and ultimately turned it into the Roman Empire. Do you see the Roman Empire? Do you see how much of the ancient world they controlled? They controlled all the shipping routes, every country. It was a remarkably powerful entity. And in the face of such an entity, no one would be able to prevail. Well, Pompey was, Julius Caesar was in northern Europe. Pompey was busy in Armenia fighting the Third Mithridatic War. You don't need to know anything about the Third Mithridatic War. All you need to know is that the Mithridates and Tigranes controlled Seleucid Syria. And when he won the war, he immediately sent one of his lieutenants, a man called Scaurus, to take over Syria, because Syria was known to be a very wealthy country. And if there's one thing that the Romans knew, it was money and wealth. In fact, Crassus is purported to have been the richest man of all time in the ancient world, besides for one, and that was Augustus Caesar. Crassus, who was one of the triumvirate, he was very crazy about getting money, but all three of them were busy with money. And Pompey wanted to make sure that he would capture this very wealthy state, Syria, and he sent Scaurus to Syria. But what happened was, they didn't have cell phones in those days. They couldn't communicate on the internet. They didn't even have any method of communication that was reliable. And when this guy arrives in Damascus, when he arrives in Syria, he discovers that two other assistants, military assistants, or we don't know exactly what they were, had already arrived in Syria on Pompey's behalf. But military people don't like to sit around and do nothing. That's the worst thing for them. So he arrives in Syria, and he's got very little to do because everything's already under control. And somebody whispers into his ear and says, "Are you aware that there's currently a siege going on in Judea, and that there's 50,000 soldiers at the gates of Jerusalem who want to take over this country of Judea, which is a very valuable piece of real estate?" He said, "Really?" Takes a group of soldiers with him, and he marches off to Jerusalem. But before he gets to Jerusalem, the message gets back to both Aristobulus and Hyrcanus, Antipater, that this Roman, I don't know what he was a military man, was making his way towards Jerusalem, and they had an opportunity now to get the support of the mightiest power of the ancient world. So they both sent ambassadors to Scaurus because they wanted to get the support of the Roman army. My friends, this is the turning point that led to the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. It's as simple as that. If you are looking for the key moment in our history that led to the dreadful Roman rule of Judea and eventually the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, it was this squabble between two entitled Hasmonean princes who felt that they wanted to rule Judea when they shouldn't have been kings in the first place, because their role was always to be high priests and nothing more. Well, what happened was that Scaurus came to Jerusalem, and he decided that it would be much easier to support Aristobulus than to support Hyrcanus. Because Aristobulus is already in Jerusalem, and if he supports Hyrcanus, he needs to get him out. So he supported Aristobulus. It was a tactical move, and the way he did it was, he knew that the Nabateans didn't want to fight the Roman army, so he went to King Aretas and he said to him, "Listen, Your Majesty, I know that you want to support Hyrcanus, but I don't advise it, because if you support Hyrcanus, it means you're an enemy of the Roman Empire." Oh well, Aretas quickly put all his belongings together and began the march back to Petra. On the way, Aristobulus sent an army, went to war, and beat Aretas' army, and now he was the most powerful, most dominant force. He took over. Pompey arrives in Syria. Immediately, both brothers go to Syria, and vie for support. Aristobulus says, why would you want Hyrcanus to be the king? I'm the most obvious choice. I'm the one who's most suited to this role. Hyrcanus says, you don't want Aristobulus as your king. He's a violent man. He's an underhanded individual. He is a criminal. And not only that, but your officials who have supported him took bribes from him, so they're also criminals. Meanwhile, Josephus reports, there was a third group of people. And the third group of people were the Pharisees, the ordinary folk, not Antipater and the Sanhedrin, but the ordinary Pharisees who were fed up. And they didn't want Aristobulus, they didn't want Hyrcanus, and they said to Pompey, we don't want either of these two. What we would like is to reestablish what was going on before the Maccabean revolt. We want a Kohen Gadol who runs the Beit HaMikdash, and we want a political representative who's going to be associated with the diplomatic activity that's required in order for us to run our affairs. But we don't want it to be either of these two brothers. Pompey, meanwhile, was very concerned because of what had happened with the Nabatean army, and he was frightened of losing an ally. So he said, actually, I need to go first and deal with the Nabatean problem. You know, Judea seems to be running itself quite smoothly. I'll get back to you guys. And he begins the march towards Petra. On the way, Aristobulus, thinking to himself, listen, why am I even seeking this guy's support? Who cares about Pompey? He's from Rome. I'm from here. I've already become the king. I'm in control. I've beaten off the 50,000-man army. I don't need Pompey. And he leaves this group that's marching to Petra and goes to some hideaway and sends a message to Pompey, thank you very much, but no thank you. Pompey, as the Romans tended to be, got very offended. He didn't like any insult to the power of Rome. They were very obsessed with the glory of Rome and the power of Rome and making sure that the dignity of Rome is never offended. I'm not Pompey. I'm a servant of the Roman Empire. And if Aristobulus, this two-bit Judean king, offends me, he doesn't offend me, he offends the entire Roman Empire. And he marches behind Aristobulus and catches up with him. Aristobulus realizes he has annoyed the wrong person, and he says, no, and he brings gifts to him, and he says, of course, I need to hear from you exactly what you think should happen in Judea. And he promises him he's going to work alongside him and he won't do anything against him. He invites him to Jerusalem. Meanwhile, he runs to Jerusalem, puts together an army to take on Pompey and his group of soldiers. When Pompey hears about this, he marches towards Jerusalem. And here we have the lesser-known siege of Jerusalem. In 63 BCE, Pompey, the great general, one of the three most powerful people in the Roman Empire, besieged Jerusalem. The supporters of Hyrcanus didn't allow the siege to proceed, and they immediately opened the gates of Jerusalem and allowed Pompey in, because they realized if they let him in, he's going to support their team. The supporters of Aristobulus barricaded themselves onto Temple Mount. And this was a moment where the future of the Beit HaMikdash, the temple in Jerusalem, hung by a thread. Pompey took a few weeks, and eventually, on Yom Kippur, he manages to get up onto the walls of the temple. It was before Herod's temple. It was a different temple. It looked different. I think we have a picture of the way the temple looked. That's the way the temple looked before Herod rebuilt it. And he comes into the temple and killed 12,000 Kohanim. They tell him he's not allowed to go into the sanctuary. These are Hyrcanus' supporters. Tell him he's not allowed to go into the sanctuary. He says, don't worry, I'm not going to defile the sanctuary. I need to see what the sanctuary holds. He walks into the sanctuary, and Josephus says he touched nothing. He went in, and apparently he was very respectful of religions, of regional religions. He went in, curiously looked at everything that was in there, went out, and told Hyrcanus, "You're now the acting king of Judea, but I'm in control. Rome is in control. You are now part of the Roman Empire." Antipater, Herod's father, calls him aside. He says, "I like the way you work. I'd like you to be Rome's ambassador to Judea. I'd like you to act as the advisor to Hyrcanus, because he's clearly not a very capable man. And I'd like you to be the tax collector on behalf of the Roman Empire and send money on a regular basis to Rome to pay for your role, for your status as a vassal state of the Roman Empire." Antipater, I'm sure, without too much hesitation, agreed to act as the Roman representative in Judea. And he became the advisor to Hyrcanus. Hyrcanus II, who is a kind of quasi-king. Later on, he changes to ethnarch. I want to tell you what a wily and cunning politician Antipater actually was. You know that very shortly afterwards, there were problems in the triumvirate. First, Julius and Pompey fought each other. Well, Pompey had been the one who appointed Antipater, but he went to Egypt and he supported Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar, as a result, appoints him to be the governor of Judea, so now he has an elevated, promoted position, and gives him the right to appoint governors of the regions within Judea. Well, who should he appoint? Descendants of the Hasmonean dynasty. He doesn't. He appoints his sons. One of them is appointed as the governor of Jerusalem. His name, I think, was Vassal, became the governor of Jerusalem. But his most dominant son, Herod, becomes the governor of Galilee. And this is where we're going to leave it this week, just with one brief piece before we end. What happened to Antipater? Antipater, the great survivor, the great politician, the great diplomat, the man who had managed to weather every possible storm, and through his friendship with the Romans and with the Hasmoneans, gain incredible power for himself and for his family in Judea. What happened to him? So Julius Caesar was assassinated in 44 BCE. In 43 BCE, Antipater was poisoned by a rival in the Judean power structure, and even though he had protected himself in every possible way, he paid a huge team of spies to ensure that he would never be poisoned. Somehow they'd outbribed him, and they bribed his cupbearer to pour poison into his cup, and he died in 43 BCE. Had he not died, and he wasn't such an old man, had he not died, his son Herod would never have become the king. His death, which was coupled with all the work he'd put in to building the power for his family, was the springboard, was the platform that enabled Herod, the governor of Galilee, of no particular origin, an Idumean pretender, to become one of the most feared and most vicious kings of the Jewish people in the late Second Temple period. We'll leave it here for now, and hopefully next Monday we'll continue the story. Thank you.